I will start with an introduction. So the first talk today is called "Are Canadian Libraries Ready to Transition from MARC to BIBFRAME?" This is by Alexandre Fortier, Heather Pretty, Olivier Spéciel, and it will be presented by Daniel Scott. They'll talk for 20 to 25 minutes, and then the rest of the time will be for questions. So take it away.
All right. Can everyone hear me? Unmuted. Thanks, Dan. Good day. Bonjour. My name is Heather Pretty. My colleagues and I will be sharing some of the results of a survey we conducted to gauge the readiness of Canadian libraries for the transition from MARC to the BIBFRAME format. But first, to provide some context, it's helpful to think that the transition from MARC to BIBFRAME will likely be similar in scope to libraries' transition from card catalogs to computer catalogs. Libraries as a whole and library system vendors will need to develop or build systems that can create and search BibFrame linked data. And at individual libraries, library staff will need training to understand how to describe items with the BibFrame vocabulary, and workflows will need to be adjusted accordingly. Next slide. Why make the transition to BibFrame? What are the benefits? Looking at this Library of Congress record for Anne of Green Gables, the personal name is listed as the string Montgomery LM Lucy Maud 1874 to 1942. The main title is listed as Anne of Green Gables / Lucy Maud Montgomery. You can see that these string literals come directly from the MARC 21, 100, and 245 fields. It is obvious through human interpretation that LM Montgomery is the author-creator of Anne of Green Gables. However, this connection is not obvious to computers. Cataloging in the BibFrame editor allows the cataloger to make explicit statements about the relationships between the author-creator and a work. As BibFrame is built and linked data, it goes beyond human interpretation. And in the background of the BF editor, uniform resource identifiers, URIs similar to web links, are added to unambiguously identify entities and relationships between those entities. One of the greatest benefits of BibFrame, however, is that it will allow library metadata to finally break out of its silo and interact with other RDF linked data on the semantic web. Next slide. Why look at this now? There is increasing momentum in the adoption of BibFrame. The Swedish National Library was the first national library to implement BibFrame in July 2018. European BibFrame workshops have been ongoing and supporting that community since 2017. Linked Data for Production, Pathway to Implementation, is the second phase of a Mellon Foundation funded collaborative project among 4 institutions in the United States of America, working alongside the Library of Congress and the Program for Cooperative Cataloging. Through LD4P2, a cohort of 20 institutions, including University of Alberta libraries, will be some of the first to transition from MARC to BibFrame in North America. The Share VDE project will convert roughly 100 million MARC records to BibFrame from LD4P2 institutions, the library community, and the Library of Congress. It is anticipated that in late 2020, Library of Congress will move to cataloging solely within the BibFrame format and will rely on its developed BibFrame to MARC and MARC to BibFrame converters to share MARC records with the rest of the library community. So although many of us will not be ready to transition to BibFrame for some time, we will increasingly see the effects of BibFrame within the MARC record ecosystem. Next slide. The Canadian BibFrame Readiness Task Force was struck in 2018 and consists of 13 members from vendor, government, public, and academic libraries across Canada, representing CFLA, FMD, Library and Archives Canada, and Library of Parliament. The task force was to help Canadian libraries prepare for the shift to BibFrame, including the directive to assess the understanding of and readiness for BibFrame transition in libraries in Canada. I'll pass over now to Olivier to introduce the survey conducted by the Task Force Survey subgroup. Next slide.
Unmute, Olivier.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your help. Thank you, Heather, for this introduction, and also for your leadership, dedication, and patience for the last 2 years while working on this project. Good day, bonjour, my name is Olivier Spéciel. For those who can read on my lips, then it's the same. And as I mentioned, survey results will inform a list of recommendations for training, education, and advocacy for Canadian libraries. From April to October 2019, the subgroup conducted an online survey in English and in French using Qualtrics software to obtain a portrait of the Canadian library community at large. For the random stratified sample, we selected survey participants from a list of more than 5,800 Canadian libraries, compiled from libraries.org and Library and Archives Canada Interlibrary Loan Database. Using these categories, we then generated a stratified random sample of more than actually 1,500 libraries. And then we clustered them into 4 mutually exclusive categories: academic libraries, public libraries, school libraries, and special libraries. And after 2 pilot phases, we launched the survey, sending emails with a link to enter the study in both English or French, targeting the person most directly responsible for cataloging and the person most directly responsible for systems. The survey had 3 parts and 44 questions, and it took approximately 18 minutes to complete. Now, the questionnaire assessed first the respondent understanding of BIBFRAME, second, their organization readiness to transition to BIBFRAME, and third, we collected demographic data about the respondent library and their role within the library. The first part of the questionnaire was regarding demographics, second part regarding readiness, and the third part regarding understanding. Next slide. Now for this presentation, we will focus only on readiness. There will be forthcoming articles on assessing understanding of BIBFRAME by the task force members. To assess readiness, the survey task force adopted a psychometric assessment that measures organizational readiness for implementing change. The main idea there, or the main hypothesis, is we were looking for the commitment or the ability to transition to BIBFRAME, like task demands, resource availability, and training factors. And we were as well looking for perception of needs, positive or negative impacts. The instrument we used includes a 5-item scale about change commitment, a 6-item scale about change efficacy, and 9 items representing various aspects of how much value respondents will place on a change. Most participants will go only to parts 2 and 3 of the questionnaires if they had indicated that they were aware of BIBFRAME at the end of the demographics sections. Next slide. So with Ulrich, we were trying to answer the question, is BIBFRAME a promising innovation? Are we looking for evidence-based guidance? And psychometric assessment that measures organizational readiness for implementing change, known as the acronym ORIC, Ulrich, is supposed to give us a pretty good idea about the commitment or the ability to transition to BIBFRAME. And the hypothesis is that when organizational readiness for change is high, organizational members are more likely to initiate change, more likely to exert greater effort, and also more likely to exhibit greater persistence and display more cooperative behavior. Of course, the result is more effective implementation. Now, the primary focus of the literature has been on individual readiness for change, not on organizational readiness, which is the difference between I'm ready versus we are ready. And we had a few questions looking at what if individual perceptual data on readiness could be aggregated to the organizational level of analysis. Is there a readiness or an understanding threshold that shall be met prior to beginning implementation of the change? And what are the valid measurements of organizational readiness for change that could reduce the number of libraries organization change efforts that either do not lead to desired benefits or fail altogether. And we adapted ORIC for this survey. And now I will leave it to Alexandre to answer the last question of this slide. Are we ready?
Thank you, Olivier.
Thank you.
I will now walk you through the results. First, let's look at who answered the survey. 189 completed questionnaires. That numbers exclude participants for whom consent was either not given or withdrawn during the exercise. We also excluded 2 questionnaires because we judged that they didn't come from a Canadian library, which brings us to 287 analyzed questionnaires. As Olivier mentioned, we use 4 types of library to stratify our sample. If we compare the proportion of each library type in our original sample with those within the analyzed questionnaires, we can see that the proportion of public libraries in dark orange on the chart follows its weight in the sample, while academic libraries in yellow are overrepresented and special and school libraries, respectively in green and blue, are underrepresented. That is something to keep in mind as we will look at some of the results. Next slide. Other variables indicated that we had a countrywide participation with questionnaires returned from libraries located in the 10 provinces and 1 territory. We reached English language and French language institutions. 53% reported having a catalog in English only, 29% a catalog in French only, and 17% a multilingual catalog. In terms of staffing, 65% of the surveyed institutions employ 1 to 5 librarians, while 19% employ none. And 50% of the libraries surveyed report having 1 to 5 staff members. Finally, if we look at the primary responsibilities within the library of the people who answered the survey, these vary greatly, the 3 most common being administration, cataloging and metadata, and all of the above. A finer analysis of the answers indicates that 38% have what we could call cataloging and metadata responsibilities. Next slide. Were people surveyed aware of BIBFRAME? The first element, and perhaps the most important one, is that only 30% are aware of BIBFRAME as a replacement for the MARC bibliographic format prior to the survey, accepted in academic libraries where the proportion rises to 69%. If we consider the fact that academic libraries are overrepresented in our sample, we can infer that the actual awareness could be even lower in the general Canadian library population. Next slide. We investigated interaction with other demographic variables, and awareness of BIBFRAME is also greater for libraries having more than 5 librarians, or libraries having more than 5 staff members. As you can see on the 2 graphs, the larger the library, the more likely is the respondent aware of BIBFRAME. Next slide. In terms of demographics for the people who answered the survey, respondents who indicated cataloging and metadata, systems, or technical services as their primary responsibility were also more likely to be aware of BIBFRAME in comparison to respondents who had other roles, including people in the all of the above categories. The second interesting element from a result is that 46% of respondents who indicated cataloging and metadata, 61% of respondents who indicated systems, and 62% of respondents who indicated technical services were not aware of BIBFRAME. That was surprising, as we expected catalogers and system librarians who were the targeted recipients of the survey to at least have some familiarity with BIBFRAME. Next slide. Do the Canadian Library Survey plan a transition to BIBFRAME? The third highlight from a result is that 85% of libraries do not yet know enough about BIBFRAME to plan a transition. That would be the green portion of the chart. About 1% of libraries in red have begun the transition already. In blue, there are 3 categories of libraries that are planning a transition, which gets about 1% each. Figures were so individual answering choices within 1 to 2 years, within 3 to 5 years, and within 5 to 10 years, that we decided to lump them together in the analysis. So only 4% plan to transition within the next 10 years. That mirrors the proportion of libraries who plan to keep using MARC records and not transition to BIBFRAME. Next slide. Given that so few participants had heard of BIBFRAME, we were unable to collect much data on organizational readiness. The gist of it is that for those who were aware of BIBFRAME, participants were neither committed nor opposed to transition. And results do not indicate any significant interactions with any of the demographic variables, such as library type, library size, or primary responsibility of the people who answered the survey. The organizational readiness scale that we employed included 5 questions assessing libraries' commitment to transition from MARC to BIBFRAME, with possible rankings from 0 to 10. And the average score is 19 out of 50, so below 50%. It also included 6 questions assessing the ability to make the transition, with possible rankings from 0 to 10. The average score is 26 out of 60, again below 50%. There were also 9 individual items measuring the perceived needs, benefits, and harms for the library to make the transition, such as cost effectiveness and timeliness of the transition. Score for these all have a median of 5 or 6 out of 10. So unfortunately, inconclusive results. Now my colleague Dan will place these results into perspective.
Thank you, Alexandre. So how have we interpreted these results? In many ways, these are early days for BIBFRAME. There are currently no off-the-shelf library systems that support encoding, indexing, and discovering metadata as BIBFRAME. So we probably shouldn't be surprised that many catalogers and system librarians haven't even heard of it. You have to be brave, and you have to have a lot of resources and runway to invest effort in adopting BIBFRAME at this time. Without resources and runway, you're likely to crash. The only library in Canada we know of that is actively working towards implementing BIBFRAME is the University of Alberta. We know this not because of the survey, but because one of their librarians, Ian Bigelow, is on the Canadian BIBFRAME Readiness Task Force with us. The University of Alberta has been working with colleagues in major libraries in the United States, such as the National Library of Medicine, Cornell, Stanford, and Harvard, and Europe, such as the Royal Danish Library and the National Library of Sweden. In comparison, most of the Canadian libraries who responded to our survey have 5 or fewer staff or librarians. We suspect their focus is on day-to-day operations, and they don't have the resources necessary to plan and prepare for a future that may be up to 10 years out, as is borne out by Alexandre's analysis. Linked data promises advantages such as multilingual and multicultural indexing and discovery, and support for exploratory search that can provide more context for people, places, and concepts by drawing on external sources of linked data. But we believe this will need to be evident in working available library systems that provide a smooth path from MARC to BIBFRAME before the awareness and adoption readiness indicators that we measured in our survey rise significantly. The eventual adoption of BIBFRAME by Canadian libraries will represent a major technological shift requiring an evolution of professional skills. Our survey has shown that Canadian libraries are not ready to adopt BIBFRAME, and we believe that this represents an important gap between theory and practice in the field that must be addressed through advocacy and professional training. As BIBFRAME matures, it may be necessary to refresh the 2006 Training Gaps Analysis for Librarians and Library Technicians report that was published by the Government of Canada's Cultural Human Resources Council. To prepare future practitioners, linked data in BIBFRAME must be a part of the curriculum of library and technical services programs. Park and Tasaka found in their 2016 survey of library workers participating in continuing education that 28.6% of respondents reported engaging in linked data training, with 23.5% engaging specifically in BIBFRAME training. Given that Park and Tasaka's survey predated ours by 4 years, those numbers seem surprisingly high. One difference between the studies, however, is the demographics of the respondents. Roughly 80% of Park and Tasaka's respondents were catalogers, metadata specialists, or heads of cataloging or metadata departments, whereas fewer than 40% of our respondents were classified as having cataloging or metadata responsibilities. Another difference is that Park and Tasaka's survey invitation was posted to a broad set of mailing lists, introducing potential response bias in that participants were self-selected and might not be a representative sample, while we used a stratified random sampling method to try to mitigate response bias. The CARL Competencies 2020 final report does not mention BIBFRAME or any standard explicitly, but references applicable competencies in categories such as the active learning and adaptation category, where they recommend knowledge of emerging trends and initiatives in library spaces and buildings, including the ability to anticipate future trends in knowledge organizations and scholarship. In the curation and preservation category, understanding how information is organized for easy identification and retrieval, including cataloging and metadata standards for all formats. And in the vision and innovation category, the ability to demonstrate creative initiative in exploring and experimenting with new ideas, technologies, and services. So we're finding that there is a gap between the theory and practice of linked data in BIBFRAME to be addressed in library and technical services programs will be incorporated into the final report of the Canadian BIBFRAME Readiness Task Force. And we're trying to follow open science principles to make the data on which that finding has been based openly available. We've already published our survey instrument on the Laurentian University Institutional Repository. And once we're satisfied that we've thoroughly anonymized the data, we will publish that as well on the Memorial University repository. We do believe that there are many opportunities for future research that can build on our work. It would be nice to have a refresh of the 2006 Cultural Human Resources Council report on training gaps, assessing MLIS and library technician curricula to determine coverage of linked data in BIBFRAME. Canada will need library professionals who can support that transition to BIBFRAME. We hope to run our study again in a few years' time to measure differences in awareness, readiness, and understanding. But not only would we like to see the results over time in Canada, we'd like to see the study replicated in different places, such as the United States, or European countries that are heavily involved in BIBFRAME development. One limitation of our study was that it was purely quantitative. We'd love to see the results of qualitative investigations, such as a case study of institutions that choose to adopt BIBFRAME to uncover the factors that influence their choice and the impact that that process has on the organization as a whole. So we'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present our findings, and we really look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you very much. We have a first question here already in the chat. I think you already addressed it briefly, but if you had any more details you wanted to speak to it, which I'll read out for the YouTube viewers who may not be able to see it. Wondering if there is comparable data for US libraries. I was late, so apologies if you mentioned this at the top.
So I guess the closest comparison that we found was Park and Tosaka's survey, and that was aimed at American libraries and American library professionals. So I believe 28.6% and 23.5% for those who were pursuing education in linked data and BIBFRAME through continuing education specifically. There hasn't been a similar survey to ours that has been applied to the United States as a whole.
Okay. Well, I've got a question myself, actually. I'm going to be teaching my students how to make MARC records in 2 or 3 weeks, actually a little bit longer than that. Do you think that I should be just continuing to focus on MARC records for now, or do you think I should be integrating more BIBFRAME material into how to make records in the future? And a follow-up question to that, assuming a particular answer, where would I find good BIBFRAME training materials?
I'll take that one. So I would go ahead and continue training your students in creating MARC bibliographic records. As we mentioned, the transition from MARC to BIBFRAME, we suspect is going to be quite similar to the transition from card catalogs to computer catalogs, which happened over the course of 10 to 15 years. And that is the number of years that's been kind of expressed by various individuals, that the majority of libraries won't make the transition to BIBFRAME from MARC for about 10 to 15 years. I would say the main thing to talk to your library students about is being aware of BIBFRAME elements that they will start seeing in MARC records. So one way to do that, there is the MARC to BibFrame and BibFrame to MARC converters. Also on the Library of Congress website or bibframe.org, the BibFrame editor itself is available for you and your students to play with. Enter data into the BibFrame editor and see how it comes out in RDF XML and a few other outputs. And other than that, if you're looking to find MARC records that have come from BibFrame, my biggest thing would be to look for the HTTP URIs, which will be in the subfield 0 of many of the fields.
So I have a question. So consider the transition from the hard catalog to the software-based and everything else, and then from the MARC to the BibFrame. It seems like the library is trying to play catch-up with improved technologies. Do you think by the time libraries generally, by the time BibFrame becomes so common and pervasive in the Canadian environment, don't you think something else will have been invented by that time, and then libraries have to like play another catch-up again? Is that the picture, or is that, am I getting the wrong vibes here?
Well, I certainly, I would not be sure what would, what's going to replace the semantic web. If somebody knows, I'd be very interested to hear about that. I think our main goal here within the library community is that we literally have millions of MARC bibliographic records. We have so much we could contribute to the broader internet community, the semantic web. But right now, our MARC bibliographic records are trapped in MARC. So I think the first step is moving our MARC bibliographic records into an RDF linked data format so that it can play better with the rest of the data on the semantic web.
I'd support that statement. And to respond to slightly to an earlier question as well, I would hope that your students, you do introduce to your students the idea of linked data, the idea that we have been so focused on a record-based format of cataloging, and that the domain of linked data is such a different paradigm for how to describe and make accessible metadata about resources, the connections that are possible, and the changes in workflows that will come. It's important to introduce them through something like Wikidata at this point is a very hands-on, very easy to grasp example of the kind of linked data that you can manipulate and address. And that might lead to at least an understanding later on when BibFrame comes that we're not dealing with our own copies of records anymore, but we're actually participating in a global attempt to describe bibliographic information.
Actually, building off of that comment there, do you imagine a sort of like single repository for all bibliographic records, like a decentralized but centralized source in the way that Wikipedia functions?
That's certainly my hope. I've been trying to work towards a decentralized method of making bibliographic metadata available as linked data for many years now. And one would pose sort of the opposite model as being the OCLC model of a centralized set of sort of tightly controlled records. So I think there are great advantages towards that. almost a federated, decentralized model of bibliographic data is the way that we would want to go. But we've got a lot of steps to go to get there, and libraries have traditionally been pretty conservative organizations, so it's not surprised to see that gap that Martins was mentioning earlier. And so we are playing catch up, but we're doing it second mover advantage, I would call it, right? Let others blaze the way, and then we can do the best job possible with the resources that we have. All
right, well, I want to thank all our presenters. We have reached 1:30, so I will turn it over to Martins Badmus to introduce our next speakers. And thank you very much for your current presentation.
Thank you.